This week we'll be looking at chapters 5 and 7 of Language and Reading Disabilities, the assessment and instruction for phonemic awareness and word recognition skills, and the assessment of morphological awareness skills. And these two chapters were put together because when you get to the chapter 8, the morphological awareness and morphological knowledge discussion, it's a multilinguistic approach to improving literacy outcomes. So therefore, when you talk about a multiple linguistic, you talk about all these language blocks and components. Phonemic awareness and the word recognition and the morphemic awareness are all playing together. So to start off, development and assessment of phonemic awareness skills. We know that phonemic awareness, strong phonemic awareness skills are critical. To having successful readers. So how does that develop and how do we instruct it is what's going to be the topic of discussion for this chapter. Phonemic awareness is an understanding that words can be broken into phonemes or sounds, and phonemes can be blended together to make words. So this is a skill that develops across time with increasing understanding. It's going to get progressively more extensive and more difficult as you're teaching it, and students are going to grow as they learn these skills. You start off with simple identify phonemes in words or segment phonemes in words, such as three-syllable words, but an example of the progression is when you move, not three-syllable, three phoneme words, a CVC word, but the progression would be when you move from your CVC patterns to your constant blends, and the initial is easier, and then of course the blends on the final position are more difficult, and the medial position are the most difficult blends to master in that skill of phoneme segmentation. So you can see how the skill level and difficulty increases as the words become more complex. So it develops across time. This is an explicit understanding that words are composed of segments of sound smaller than a syllable, as well as knowledge or awareness of distinctive features of individual phonemes themselves. And we talked about that in last week's discussion. Now, in last semester's discussion, it came up about phonemic awareness versus phonological awareness, and often they're used interchangeably, but there is a difference between the two. Now, when we talk about the 5 essential components of reading, I usually refer to phonological awareness because although sometimes in text you'll see that phonemic awareness is one of the 5 essential components of reading with fluency, phonics, comprehension, and vocabulary, in general, the consensus is that it's phonological awareness because you cannot disregard the components of writing and syllable segmentation and sentence segmentation that happens in phonological awareness. So the phonemic awareness is very narrow and focused at the phoneme level. Phonological awareness is a broader term that refers to general level awareness at the word, syllable, and sentence level. So with phonological awareness, you add syllable and sentence. Phonemic awareness is just this sound level. So there are measures of phonemic awareness, and we know that that's more predictive in reading and spelling growth than any other measure that we can do when children are young. We also know that children with language impairment are 4 to 5 times more likely to have reading problems, and children with speech impairments are at higher risk for reading disabilities as well. So those components of phonological awareness and phonemic awareness are linked in with those children who have language impairments and speech sound impairments, speech sound disorders. Of course, if you have a speech sound disorder, your weakness is in the language area of phonology. And when it comes to language impaired children, their language is so severely impacted across the board. That's why they are at higher risk for reading disabilities. So what is the importance of phonemic awareness in learning to read? It contributes to the growth of early reading skills in at least 3 ways. It helps children understand the alphabetic principle and develop alphabetic knowledge. So to know that letters represent sounds, you need to understand that words can be broken down into sounds and make a letter-sound correspondence connection. It helps children notice the regular ways that letters represent sounds in words. So it reinforces knowledge of individual sound letter correspondence, and it helps in forming mental representations of words and involved a close amalgamation of their written and spoken forms. And I just use my phonemic awareness to decode and read amalgamation because I am familiar with that word, but I'm not used to pronouncing it. So there are examples all the time that you can find of how we as fluent readers apply our phonemic awareness knowledge. Number 3, it helps children become flexible decoders to decode even irregular words, and it makes it possible to generate possibilities for words and contexts that are only partially sounded out. So if you only know how to sound out part of the word but not the whole word, it helps with that. Now, it is important, though, for young children to become accurate readers as quickly as possible because words must be read accurately and a number of times before they can become a part of a child's sight vocabulary. So when you move from sounding out word by word, that's when it becomes a sight word. And we'll get into the definition of sight words in a little while. So the movement towards fluency or automaticity, you'll have to hear me say. If it's automatic, the minute you see it, you read it, you don't have to decode it, it happens through the building of phonemic awareness. The primary impact of phonemic awareness is the contribution to the ability to use sound letter correspondence. So again, over and over again, to know that letters represent that sound that the word has in it. There's a highly consistent effect for training in phonemic awareness on the development of reading skills. So essentially, how well does phonemic awareness aid in developing reading and helping children learn how to read? Across studies, and they have used all these meta-analysis to examine whenever they had taught phonemic awareness or phonological awareness what the outcomes for reading were. And overall, consistently, they find that there's an impact of moderate relation between phonological awareness during preschool and later decoding once reading instruction begins in school, and a similar correlation of reading comprehension for early phonological awareness skills. So this skill is very critical from very early on and can predict reading ability later on. There's a highly consistent effect for training in phonemic awareness on the development of reading skills. So how, by teaching it, we can help reading grow. This was the study by Airy and her colleagues in 2001. They looked at 52 studies of reading and found overall phonemic awareness was highly consistent and had the most significant effect on improving reading ability. Significant effects can be found for direct instruction for increasing phonological awareness as well. So very direct instruction, teaching phonological awareness to students. So not only the student's ability to do phonological awareness tasks, but again, instruction in phonological and phonemic awareness. By teaching it, the children become better readers. So how do we assess phonemic awareness? First of all, what's our purpose for assessment? Our purpose is to identify children at risk for reading failure before reading instruction actually begins. So in preschool, in the beginning of kindergarten, when they're not actually reading, this is your primary assessment for their risk level for reading difficulties. You also can use phonemic awareness to monitor children's progress in acquiring critical reading skills. So you monitor a skill, say for instance, let's use Dibbles. And Dibbles monitors initial sound fluency at the beginning of the year, sometime in August. And you look at initial sound fluency, how quickly students are able to identify the first sound in words. And any student who falls in the red, which is the most at-risk category, you can choose whether or not to do an intervention with them to teach them that particular skill. Now, is it going to be a small group intervention, or is it going to be whole class instruction, just moving them through the curriculum of teaching phonologic awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics in early kindergarten letter sound correspondence? So the method that you choose with the students can vary depending on the needs of the students. Usually kindergarten teachers can sort through which students are the most needy based on their other skills and other assessments that they're using. But if you target this skill, then you can progress monitor it over a few weeks. On Dibbles, again, as our example, it has at least 20 progress monitoring probes. So you don't even have 20 weeks between the first Dibbles assessment and the mid-year Dibbles assessment. And so that would allow you to do one assessment per week if you wish, but that would be very extreme. Usually one assessment per week is reserved for your tier 3 most extreme children. But you can use the progress monitoring to assess them every 2 to 3 weeks on that same skill to see if they're progressing, if they're learning it, if they're growing in it. And so that's one purpose of phonological and phonemic awareness assessment. The assessment also can help describe the level of phonological impairment in children being diagnosed with reading disabilities. However, using it as a diagnostic isn't often as beneficial as using it as a screener. Now, the single screening of phonemic awareness can over or under identify students, but the progress monitoring of skills several times through pre-K through first grade can resolve this. The more you progress monitor, the more accurate information you're gathering. And again, this falls in line with the dynamic assessment principles. And of course, RTI. This is exactly how RTI is designed to work, to monitor progress on one specific skill. Now, phonemic awareness assessment may not add to the diagnosis of reading disabilities as far as the comprehensive assessment because it's highly correlated to phonemic decoding skills. So by the time you get to a reading assessment and the types of assessments you're doing in relation to decoding, phonemic awareness doesn't seem to be as influential at that level. By the time you get there and the child has more or should have more knowledge of letter sound correspondence and orthographic principles. So therefore, it's not as effective there, but it is very effective in the screening level. Now, procedures and measures used to assess phonemic awareness, essentially, there were lots of different measures out there, and then one study took everything together and broke it down into 3 basic skills. You have phoneme segmentation, which requires explicit level of phoneme awareness, and this is breaking the words down into the individual sounds, identifying the initial sounds and words, identifying the final sounds and words, but breaking the sounds apart. And phoneme synthesis, on the other hand, the child must blend the individual phonemes pronounced by the assessor into words. So the assessor says, at, what's the word? And they need to say fat. Is the example that they use in the book. And you can really tell my most severely learning disabled children that I've ever had have so much difficulty with the phoneme synthesis, with the blending. And I don't have the research to back it up necessarily, but this is usually a huge red flag when they cannot perform that phoneme blending task. And to me, it goes all back to that phonological memory component of learning disabilities, language learning disabilities that we talked about in chapter 4, I think. No, chapter 3. In last week's discussion, that phonological memory, the ability to retain all the phonemes in the memory and then string it together and retrieve it, phonological retrieval as well, it's just too much of a cognitive demand on their systems. And with their primary weakness being in the phonological component, they just can't retain the information to reproduce it for these phoneme synthesis tasks. So the blending is a huge red flag for me when I'm working with students. And then finally, sound comparison, which makes comparisons between the sounds in different words. Do cat and bat end with the same sound? Do cow and cat begin with the same sound? So you're just comparing, and it could be at any level of comparison. Now, the book also points to Table 5. Table 5 gives a list of measures of phonological and phonemic awareness. It tells you the grade range, the skills tested, most common use, individual versus group, and criterion or norm referenced. Ones that you'll see in schools, you see a lot with DIBELS, the dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. And then I have used the phonological awareness test pretty frequently. It's actually the phonological awareness test 2, and I like it because it has all the components of phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and it has graphemes at the end and some decoding there, as well as even a section for invented spelling. So it seems pretty comprehensive when it comes to covering all the orthographic and the phonemic components. I'm familiar with the Texas Primary Reading Inventory, Ames Web, the Test of Phonemic Awareness. Most of these I'm familiar with. I have not used anything other than those that I've named. So, there, and Linda Mood, of course, very familiar to people in our field. Now, there will be more tests to add to this list as the years go by. I believe the test of integrated language skills that I spoke of last semester that's being normed right now will have components of phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. And in addition, the third grade literacy gateway test that the state's requiring is Renaissance learning, the STAR test, and that's going to be a computer-based test. So there will be people who are doing that at younger grades besides grade 3, because it is the literacy gateway test that the legislature is requiring that all students must pass this test to show that they are fluent readers to graduate or to move out of third grade. If you fail this test, then you have to be retained in third grade again. And so you'll hear schools talking about that. MAPS is another assessment or school-wide screener schools have used. CPAA, there are all kinds of screeners out there. So you really need to be very selective in as you're working with teachers and on the curriculum teams and taking other leadership roles. And then this about how you're choosing the test and what types of measures what types of methods they're using for to measure these skills. Because my argument for DIBELS over something like STAR or MAP is that DIBELS is oral and those tests are computer-based. And I find it hard to believe that you can measure an oral skill, such as phonemic awareness, through a computer, because it's not requiring the child to produce anything orally. And that's what we need to bring to the table as speech-language pathologists, because so often things get lost in how do we test, and to the older grades. They're not thinking about it at our grade levels where it's critical to know their phonological and phonemic awareness skills. That is an oral skill. You have to be able to hear them produce those sounds to adequately assess what they're doing. I will show you. All right, this is a tool that I often use when it comes to screeners, rti4success.org. And let me go back. I clicked on, let me just go to the home so you can see what I did. Essential components of reading, universal screening, screening tools chart. And this is a chart for all of the universal screeners that for reading and math. So here you'll see DIBELS 6th edition, DIBELS Next, which is what we use. First sound fluency is the component of tell me the first sound in the word. The graph tells you those little circles. I have to look at it. Convincing evidence, partially convincing evidence, unconvincing evidence, and data unavailable. So it's interesting that on DIBELS Next, which is the latest version of DIBELS, first sound fluency, it has unconvincing evidence. But when it came to initial sound fluency, which is not even listed here, it doesn't even tell you what the evidence rating was for that. Phoning, cementation, fluency, that's the skill we're talking about. Okay, here we go. DIBELS 6th edition, it had moderate evidence, but here it had unconvincing evidence. So I'm not really sure what they're using to analyze everything, but I find it helpful to know what kind of measure you're looking at as an individual, as a group, how much time it takes. ClassWorks is a screener I'm familiar with. Ames Web, which has components of the DIBELS. So you could have used DIBELS and Ames Web together. And Easy CBM as a math measure. I'm not familiar with FAST. That seems to be a new one. Here is M-Class, which is also compatible with DIBELS. Here's STAR, which is what I was talking about, the Renaissance learning. Has early literacy. it's 10 minutes computer scored. But again, on a computer test, how are you going to know what they're doing orally? TPRI is one they mentioned. So a lot of the ones that they mentioned in this chart aren't mentioned here because that chart's a little bit more comprehensive. So information updated. All those stars or asterisks were added just recently. They weren't even there at the end of the school year this year because I just looked at this chart a few months ago. So that's just an example of a tool that you can use to know what kind of measure the school is using whenever they start talking about, okay, this is what we use for our universal screening data. Okay. Now, procedures and measures used to, table 5.1. We did that. So let's move on to the next slide. Development and assessment of word recognition. So how do we identify words? This is how do we read words. We do this through 5 ways. Identify and blend together individual phonemes in words. That's phonemic decoding. That's at this individual level where you're going decoding, sounding out letter by letter, sound by sound. 2 is noticing and blending together familiar spelling patterns, which improves speed because groups of letters are processed as units. So for speed, you go speed, and even though you only blended the clusters, and of course the E is just one sound but represented by 2 letters, someone who's at the phonemic level might still be going sp, e, 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 d. Recognizing words as whole units or reading by sight is the 3rd level. These are read rapidly with no pauses between different parts of words. Usually when it says read rapidly within 1 second, and this is known as orthographic processing, which is to refer to the way that words are recognized by sight. In next few slides, we'll talk about the definition of sight words. So in research, though, it's known as orthographic processing, recognizing the words by sight. Now, number 4 is making analogies to other words that are already known. They use, again, that fountain example. You know the word fountain, and you may not know the word mountain, but you know A-U-N-T-A-I-N says mountain. So put the M in front, and that must mean, say, mountain. And then finally, using clues from the context to guess a word's identity. But this is not done by skilled readers because only about 10% of the words can be correctly guessed from context alone. So you can teach it, but you don't want them to rely on context alone for learning meaning. Now, there's also morphological awareness, a method of identifying words, which is the knowledge of units of meaning in language. And it, of course, it also aids in identifying unknown words by recognizing prefixes, suffixes, and morpheme patterns like ing and ed and s plurals. So what are some of the issues in assessment of word recognition skills? We must have precise and reliable information about the level of performance on important subskills in reading. However, the type of diagnostic assessments that we have listed in Table 5.2 typically differ from informal assessments of word recognition skills used frequently by teachers. So those are the 2 issues that we have regarding assessment of word recognition. It takes a long time to really thoroughly assess word recognition skills and phonological and phonemic learning skills in every single child. Usually you're relying on some type of screening measure, such as on DIBELS. They have nonsense word fluency where they're reading make-believe CVC words or VC words. Well, that's not going to give you any information on how a child's reading non-words with digraphs and diphthongs. So it's very limiting. It's a screener, it's an indicator, but it's not an assessment. It's not thorough enough. So some commonly used measures of word recognition, Table 5.2 lists some. Again, it has DIBELS, and they do the nonsense word fluency, phonemic decoding fluency, which would be phoneme segmentation. I know y'all are familiar with the Great Oral Reading Test. The Woodcock-Johnson you'll often see used, but that's the diagnostic level, not for screening. Ames Webb is listed there again. So several different types of measures of word assessment. Oh, and let's see, in Dibbles it says phoneme decoding fluency and text reading fluency, because it has you read oral reading fluency passages, but it doesn't even mention that they do the non-word or make-believe word fluency on Dibbles as well. So these charts are good, but they're not completely comprehensive. There's maybe some other sources out there that you can use that list more types of charts for assessment. Sorry, I'll have to move my cat. He's stepping on the keypad. All right. But essentially, all measures of word recognition should include assessment of word reading accuracy, both in context and out of context, phonemic decoding skills, and reading fluency. Those are the ones that you want to, the types of measures that you want to look for in measures of word recognition skills. So what does, now that we've established what assessment looks like, our purpose for assessment, and how are we going to get to the appropriate assessment level, what does effective code-focused classroom instruction look like? How do we teach these kids these skills necessary once we've identified what their areas of weakness are? Instruction to stimulate phonological awareness should begin by providing exposure to rhyming songs, books, and activities for children in preschool and the early part of kindergarten. And it needs to be progressive. Hold on. Okay, let me back up for just a second and re-emphasize and reiterate that this effective classroom instruction is following the tier model, and that what is good, effective tier 1 instruction. And we'll get to that in just a second, but when you're looking at classroom instruction, it's multi-tiered. Tier 1 is your general classroom instruction. Tier 2 is more focused and strategic, and Tier 3 is your most intensive instruction for your individuals having the most difficulties. So that has to be an essential underlying component before you even start the classroom instruction, is that you're going to differentiate the instruction, make things different for the children's needs, and individualize the instruction based on the children's needs. So phonological awareness, and you begin with rhyming and you progress through these skills. And I have I think it's at school, I have a ladder that eventually I'm going to find and post to this site of phonemic awareness and phonological skills. But this is the examples I use in table 5.3 do follow a progression. So you're talking about your progression is essentially rhyming, then you're at sentence segmentation level, then you break it down to syllable segmentation level, and then you go to word segmentation level. And then from the word segmentation level, that phoneme segmentation, you can do identification and deletion and manipulation. Manipulation being the hardest skill, phoneme manipulation. So you can see where the activities that they're suggesting are following that progression. Now, in regards to word recognition, how do we teach word recognition skills? It should also explicitly follow a scope and sequence that parallels phonological awareness instruction by beginning by teaching high utility consonant letter sound correspondence. And table 5.4 lists the phases and activities that you are teaching in regards to phonics instruction, essentially, or letter sound correspondence word recognition skills. So you want to introduce frequent initial and ending sounds followed by short vowels, then consonant digraphs and long vowels, then vowel digraphs, and then finally variant vowel digraphs and diphthongs. And a key component here, students must practice reading words using these sounds. If they're not practicing using these words in reading, they're not going to carry it over to reading. So just like last semester's course emphasized, you have to put it in context. Now, you'll hear the word sight word in schools, usually talking about the Dolch sight word list, for instance, or the Fry sight words. And that's a misuse of the term sight word. Sight word is any word that a student can read from memory, whether they learned it through phonics or they've learned it from straight memorization. Any word that you recognize by sight. So we are all sight word readers. Now, irregular words are words that contain spelling patterns that do not follow the rules, such as said and was, and words that don't follow your common rules for phonics. And then finally, high frequency words are words that appear frequently in print, and these are what are usually referred to as the Dolch sight words, or the Fry sight words, and that they are they appear multiple times in print. They can be regular, like that and with, and, or they can be irregular, said, was, some. All right, so teachers can instruct children about syllable types and how to use morphemic analysis. Children can be taught explicitly how to use context in words, but not in isolation, and children need opportunities to frequently read aloud with feedback from instructors. So the key component here too is fluency. Practice, practice, practice. You teach it explicitly, and then you give them opportunities for practice. So Tier 1 instructional strategies. What does Tier 1 look like? We know that it needs that if you incorporate preventative early literacy instruction, phonological awareness, and phonics, it needs to be done even before they read in preschool, in kindergarten. Of course, preschool is not always going to be possible, but beginning in kindergarten, they need early literacy instruction in these two components. This can consist of small group, brief instruction, usually about 15 minutes daily, that's engaging. Number 2, principle of Tier 1 instructional strategies, methods that integrate instruction and alphabetic knowledge and phonics to link phonemic awareness to reading and spelling are most effective. So the phonological awareness skill that you're teaching, say maybe it is initial sound fluency, first sound identification, you link that skill into your lesson on words that start with the letter M and with the sound. So the phonological awareness and phonics should be combined, and it needs to be integrated to carry over for better context, or rather integrated into the context for better carryover and faster mapping of those words into sight words. Now, you need systematic and explicit reading instructional programs with emphasis on code-focused skills. These are the ones that are most effective. Even children who are at risk, or at the most at risk, can reach national average in reading performance with good, systematic, explicit reading instructional programs. You need focus on a limited set of skills, and to teach these skills explicitly and systematically. Explicit instruction, I've had teachers ask me 2 years ago when we were in curriculum adoption, or textbook adoption rather, what does it mean to be explicit and systematic? And so I gave them a general definition, but now I know to go back and give them this definition because this is very well defined. Explicit includes modeling, guided practice, and immediate corrective feedback, such as the scaffolded learning strategies that we've learned about. And the systematic instruction is based on a scope and sequence that moves from easier to more difficult tasks. So like I was saying, the stair-step ladder of phonological awareness skills. And then finally, you need to ensure that teachers have the knowledge to use the data to inform instruction. All teachers, special ed, speech language pathologists, regular education teachers, everybody needs to have the knowledge of how to use the data. And really, they don't have sufficient knowledge yet based on what they're getting in their training programs when they're coming out of college. And there's a lot of research about teacher knowledge. That's what my dissertation was on, and the teacher knowledge of phonological awareness and phonics principles. And it's not there right now. The State Department is pushing letters training, which is Louisa Moats's program of language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling. It's essentially teaching teachers about the language components. So it's a very good program. Again, based my dissertation off of it. And I went through myself my first year teaching. And it was very helpful for me to see the reading teacher's perspective, or the curriculum perspective of things. So if you ever have the opportunity to do letters, it's well worth it. And hopefully that will help improve teachers' knowledge of these language principles, but generally they don't have this knowledge and skill set. So supplemental interventions. These are intensive and skillfully delivered instructional interventions that, intensive and skillfully delivered instructional interventions produce the largest gains in phonemic decoding ability. So you need things that are intensive and skillfully delivered means, again, that systematic and explicit instruction. Explicit segmentation intervention and analyzing words to the level of individual phonemes may also support reading development in students with language impairments. So teaching these skills that all students benefit from need to be taught with extra care to children with language and speech impairments. And you need to combine this with speech production and phonological training and link it to the curriculum and what the teacher is teaching. You can't just teach your skills in isolation in your little room. You have to get into the curriculum and see what the teacher's doing in the classroom in order to be the most effective SLP in your instruction and help your children to be more successful in the curriculum. So instruction becomes more explicit when we make less assumptions about pre-existing skills of children. You can't assume they know anything. You have to teach them everything directly, including phonologic awareness and sound letter correspondence and strategies to use these skills to decode. So how do they apply the knowledge they've learned to use it to decode? They don't just automatically carry over that. Once you see a word that you don't know, you sound it out. They need to be taught that. They need careful, systematic focus on building reading fluency well and lots and lots and lots of reading fluency practice. It must be more intensive, which involves more teacher-student instructional interactions per unit of time. So you can do this in two ways. You can lengthen instructional time or reduce the teacher-pupil ratio. And usually teacher-pupil ratio reduction is the most logistically possible one that you can do. So small group instruction provided during the reading block by the classroom teacher is sufficient usually to provide this extra instruction. So beyond the whole class instruction, you have a small group for your tier 2 or your tier 3 kids, or your more strategic supported kids. And then one-to-one has not been shown consistently to be more effective than small group instruction. And I have parents all the time, well, I want one-on-one, I want one-on-one. Well, what's the purpose of getting the one-on-one? Because it's not necessarily going to make them better readers. It just sounds better and based on what parent perception is, but it's not consistently better when it comes to instruction. Particularly, you miss learning opportunities from other students. We know children learn from each other as much as they learn from us. And so there's a lot of missed opportunities for social interactions and learning from each other when you have one-on-one instruction. Then you need more supportive instruction by providing more emotional support for these students and then giving them carefully scaffolded interventions. You can emphasize a phonics instruction that incorporates letter sound identification with word blending or word patterns, which are rhymes. And there are some reading programs out there that do that. The studies with the highest effects emphasize phonics instruction that incorporate letter sound correspondence. For the most effective instruction, you need to emphasize that. That's at the bottom of page 135. And then finally, it mentions What Works Clearinghouse at the bottom of page 136, and I can show you that as well. What Works Clearinghouse reading. But it does take a lot of time to go through this and really analyze the types of studies that they're reporting on. So, for instance, when it came to textbook adoption, it was really difficult to type in journeys, for instance. Horizon Journeys. Now, see, that's not the reading program. Okay, it has Fast Forward. Direct instruction, early literacy. So it just reviews the different publications. It's like a gigantic base for meta-analysis and evidence-based practice. But it still has a lot that could be increased as far as evaluation of programs. Because it's very specific to the programs rather than overall textbooks, for instance, of what you're being marketed by the textbook companies to purchase for your classroom. So see here, Fast Forward, literacy or beginning reading. This is the improvement index, and so you can see that the improvement index there is a 6. Extent of evidence is medium to large. There's been a lot of research into Fast Forward learning. Corrective reading, repeated reading, reading mastery, small evidence of this. This is something we use for intervention in our school. These are all alphabetics. Then here's early reading, writing, phonological awareness training plus letter knowledge training. So that's just training in general. That's not necessarily a set program that you can purchase. So that's showing you right there that the training of teachers is one of the biggest biggest factors you can have for the most effective growth in reading skill and knowledge and acquisition. And print knowledge. So these are just overviews of different programs. Reading achievement. See, there's reading mastery with a large 28 improvement index, but with a small extent of evidence. So it depends on what area you're looking at as far as the success level. Fast forward again, fast forward for language. We've seen aerobics a couple of times. All right, reading comprehension. Reading recovery is there. That's probably one you're familiar with. Then you can click on it and it'll tell you about the program. Here's Linda Mood. And of course, Linda Mood's really not designed for reading comprehension as much as it is just general reading automaticity. And reading mastery is definitely not designed for reading comprehension. Language, that's another program that I'm familiar with that teaches good phonics and phonological awareness, see phonemic awareness, phonics, word recognition. Now, it's not going to be good for reading comprehension because it's not what it's designed for. And it doesn't have a measure of these skills that the program is designed to do. So it's worth exploring if you're interested in the different types of evaluations this has. All right. So what about our instruction for poor responders? These are the kids who don't respond to anything. The non-responders are the treatment resistors who don't show strong growth trajectories. They're your most severe kids, your special education children who have severe significant reading disabilities. Their corresponding characteristics to poor performance are slow performance on rapid naming tasks. That would be your letter naming tasks, those phonological memory tasks we talked about in the last week's discussion, attention and behavior problems, poor phonological memory, poor orthographic processing, and low IQ or verbal IQ ability. This should be about 3 to 5% of your population. So not very many, generally your special education population. So it's important that the SLP, the special ed teacher, the regular ed teacher, everyone needs to collaborate on the IEPs based on screening data, progress monitoring, and tailor interventions to them. So of course, IEPs need to be individualized, but you need to use all your data from your screening and your progress monitoring and incorporate that into the IEP. Dynamic assessment could be used to distinguish poor responders from others because unfortunately, you might have many children that are struggling in phonemic awareness, and it might be difficult to identify the ones who can potentially be the poor responders and get them the more intensive help earlier versus the ones who just needed a little extra support and explicit instruction. So, because typically it takes a while, it takes a few years in school before they can be identified as learning disabled because of the amount of children who are in the system who need this explicit instruction, the amount of developmental time. How do we distinguish the poor responders from the just slower learners early on? So you can use dynamic assessment and progress monitoring to see if they're responding and making progress to your instruction. Also, dynamic assessment incorporates changes in instructional methods. And of course, this all falls into the RTI framework. So you don't just do one thing over and over again the same way. You try different methods of instruction, such as multisensory strategies, and continuing your explicit instruction, but incorporating other research-based strategies to help these children learn how to do these skills. But again, teaching phonemic decoding is more effective than anything else in helping these children learn how to read. So we come back to the same thing over and over again. So some future research and development needs. You need stronger procedural guidelines for RTI because it varies so much from state to state and even from district to district. And states have set forth their own guidelines and they may or may not be utilized appropriately in schools. You have a need for professional development for teachers, school psychologists, SLPs, and SPED teachers. Everybody needs to learn how to work under this new framework and to use the data to drive the instruction. and to differentiate the instruction for students. You need more research on how effective interventions can be when delivered to students who have not been helped by Tier 1 and Tier 2. So we really don't have a lot of research for the poor responders and what really works for them. We need more research in that area. We need better understanding of the range of individual differences and the level of word recognition ability and fluency required for good reading comprehension. So essentially there's so much variation and individual differences in every child. We don't have a good grasp on how those individual differences impact overall reading ability. And then we need accountability standards and measures that better reflect student performance than multiple choice, teach the test assessment that we've been using in the past. I think that I haven't seen the Common Core assessment. I think that's the hope of everyone for Common Core, is that it will have better accountability and have better measurements of students' critical thinking skills, because students in today's world have to think critically, and you can't just do that by multiple choice closed type questions. So we all of these types of questions I keep on mentioning over and over in the lectures, Park or MCT3 is supposed to be able to do this. It's supposed to be able to answer make students answer these questions in more critical thinking ways. They're going to be required to give 2 answers sometimes, because they know that there can be more than one right answer. They have to write and support their arguments. So it'll be interesting to see how it all rolls out. So let's move on to spelling assessment intervention, a multiple linguistic approach to improving literacy outcomes. And I hope, if you're still around in Mississippi, next spring, March 30th, Julie Masterson, who is co-author of this chapter with Ken Apple and Danielle Brimo, but Julie Masterson will be our pre-conference speaker at Misha. So she's going to be fabulous and talk about all of these different things that is her area of research. So what is language basis of spelling? We know that traditional spelling instruction, remember you got the list of words, you had to write it 5 times each throughout the week, and then you were given the spelling test on Friday. So it's just rote memorization activities of words with little in common and no explicit instruction on why words were spelled that way. It's just you give them a list and you expect them to memorize that. But, and the idea is that spelling in English is illogical. It doesn't follow a pattern, but that's just simply not true. Not only is spelling logical, but only about 4% of English words are truly irregular. Everything else, you can identify the nature of the spelling based on the morphology and morphological rules, the phonics rules, the root words and base words and roots, Latin roots, Greek roots, French. So it all depends on where the word is coming from. And so when you analyze all of those components of the words, you truly have very few words that are irregular. The linguistic and language knowledge related to spelling, though, is really unknown to teachers, as I pointed out earlier. So what is the language basis of spelling? Well, you're going to use these 4 areas of language to help teach spelling patterns. First of all, phonology. We obviously, if you come away with nothing from this class, come away with the fact that you have to teach these phonological awareness skills to students. So, or this phonemic awareness of phonology. Linguistic principle of phonology has to be taught explicitly to students. So is the use of phonological knowledge or phonemic awareness. Orthography is the knowledge required to represent spoken language in writing. There's 2 types. There's word-specific memories, or MGRs, and there's orthographic pattern knowledge, which is usually not a focus in traditional spelling. And that's the knowledge that a set of patterns or conventions and individuals apply when translating speech into print. So CK patterns, or that the K sound, the example the book uses is that K can be spelled with, or K can be spelled with C, CK, K, or CH. And the knowledge of letters like DR is an allowable letter combination, JR, unless it's the word junior. The abbreviation junior is not. Now, morphology, and we've talked about this a little bit so far, is explicit ability to consider the morphemic structure of words, how word spellings change as the result of adding a morpheme, and the relationship between morphologically related words and overt knowledge of affixes, which are prefixes and suffixes. Finally, semantics is how meaning affects spelling. So homophones and homonyms. They're going to the basketball game. I went to their game, there and there. So, and then they talk about the mental graphemic representations, or MGR, separately. These are word-specific mental representations of words, and essentially you're causing the students to have a fast mapping of the word via exposure, and this allows for fluent spelling and reading skills. Excuse me. So this is an approach you can take to teaching spelling. Now, what's the relationship between spelling and other literacy skills? We know growth in spelling is correlated highly with growth in word level reading, written composition, and reading comprehension skills. The relation between spelling and word level reading is high in children with and without reading disabilities. So you find high correlations there. Spelling is associated with reading comprehension because of fluency due to good MGRs. Essentially, if you're not having to sound each word out individually, then you're using less cognitive resources in one area. And this allows you to use the cognitive resources for the other areas of organizing your writing or comprehending what's written, or inferring meaning from what the writing is. So, but the more demand that you have for sounding words out, because you have to sound them out sound by sound, and this is equivalent spelling with decoding, essentially. Spelling is encoding. It's writing words out. Decoding is sounding words out to make them into words, to read them. So the more you have to allocate for spelling and writing it sound by sound, the less resources you have for other aspects of written compositions. So what are some developmental spelling theories? Of course, you have a stage theory like you do in reading. And this is the use of language knowledge in a stair-step fashion, following a progression. You do this step first, this step second, this step third. However, if you really look at it, the thought has moved to that you have a repertoire of language knowledge blocks, and that children of varying ages can apply language knowledge from all blocks. Even if Kennedy is not a completely fluent reader or completely knowledgeable in phonics, she's using a variety of her skills to attack words and decode them and to spell them based beyond just her phonologic awareness, which is her strongest skill right now, because that's where she is in her reading instructional level. So she uses her sight word knowledge, she uses the patterns of spelling, her morphological knowledge, because she knows EDs and INGs and S's and things like that. So all children can be seen using that even as early as early stages of reading development. So there's an importance of foundational language knowledge used for spelling now. It's what the general theory is that you must have a foundational language knowledge to be able to spell adequately. So what is the meta-linguistic approach to assessment? You have different types of assessment. You have standardized measures. They are available, but they do not facilitate treatment planning or the effects of instruction. In other words, you can't write goals from the standardized assessment, and you can't analyze their progress based on progress monitoring data from standardized assessment. So other ways to multilinguistically analyze spelling: you can determine goals using a sufficient sample of words that you've elicited. They give the example of the spelling evaluation for language and literacy 2, which is a standardized test. I'm sorry, not a standardized test, but it is a published test for eliciting spelling for an analysis. But you also can analyze words from the general education curriculum, maybe words by the unit, and analyze their spelling errors based on what's being taught in that unit and what has been taught in the past, what the expectation is, and what will be taught. Because the spelling patterns and words, even in the curriculum, even if it's not systematic and explicit, you can see that they get progressively harder. You usually have your simple phonics words, and then you have, I think our teachers call them their star words, or their power words, which they're usually the big vocabulary words from the text they were reading, because they usually pull the spelling words from the text, the reading story for that week, because they go through that traditional, we read a story a week as a class together, and everything, all of our language lessons are built around that story. But it's not very systematic. It's just usually pretty randomly drawn out of there. The words that are considered vocabulary words are pulled out, And so there's the component of teaching vocabulary integrated with spelling in the spelling test. And so I'm always having the conversation with teachers when they're talking about spelling and spelling errors. What are you trying to measure here? Are you trying to measure their knowledge of the meaning of the word, hence vocabulary, or are you trying to measure their ability to spell the word by sounding it out? More phonologic component. And that's something that they struggle with sometimes. Another thing that you'll run into is that vocabulary in school to a teacher means the words they've taught by sight. They're sight words, they're high frequency words. Whereas, of course, vocabulary to us has a totally different meaning. So we can list a sample of words. We can identify the orthographic patterns that are misspelled. You do this by determining the accuracy level, the errors of phonological knowledge, errors of orthographic pattern knowledge, and inadequate MGRs, and errors in morphological knowledge. So you take all those areas of language, those language blocks, and determine if it's a phonological error because it's a cluster and they omitted one of the clusters. It's orthographic pattern knowledge because the book is using the rain example. So the pattern is spelled ran for rain. That's an orthographic pattern knowledge because ran is a CPC. It's always going to be a short vowel. If it's a incorrect yet plausible or legal, so RANE, rain for rain, that's a morphological or inadequate MGR rather. And then a morphological error would be something that was misspelled, such as talked with a T, TALKT, for talked, past tense. It's not really that morphological rule. It's phonologically correct, but it doesn't follow the morpheme rules that we have. So you can use this assessment to measure progress. So you want to document baseline performance and monitor their progress. Again, following that RTI framework and model. They give the example of the spelling sensitivity score. And this system has been shown to identify students with across grade level differences in students across grade levels. So you calculate it by first parsing out all pro words into base words, juncture, and affix elements. Is scored on a scale of 0 to 3. And you give 1 point for omitted elements are scored as 0. Elements misspelled illegally are given 1 point. Elements misspelled legally are given 2 points. And completely correct spelling elements are given 3 points. And then you can use that to calculate what their score is and go from there. So how do you do a multilinguistic approach to spelling instruction and intervention in a school, in a classroom? You did all this assessment measures to drive your intervention. Now, of course, classroom teachers and even you as an SLP are not going to have time to do spelling assessments on every single one of your students. Typically, what I'll see is that the teachers will talk to me about the spelling errors the students are having. I say, well, bring me your spelling test. And so they'll have those 10 words on the paper, and I'll analyze the spelling based on the curriculum spelling test there. I say, okay, well, this is a phonological error because they omitted this sound, and this is a phonics error. They really don't understand this phonics pattern yet, but look, they're spelling it like it sounds. So I take that multilinguistic approach and apply it to the spelling test and samples that teachers give me. Then to teach it, you can use scaffolding to facilitate student learning using the strategy: I do it, we do it, y'all do it, you do it. Very simply stated. You do the example first, and when everybody does it together, then the students do it themselves, and then you do it independently. So how do you use a prescriptive multilinguistic spelling intervention? Students' spelling provides guidance on the specific underlying foundational language knowledge blocks that need strengthening. So whenever I analyze spelling, I'll say, okay, well, you need to do interventions in phonics to try to build those phonics skills. And this book goes through a couple of examples of how to do different activities and strategies for the specific areas of language blocks. I used to do, let's see, let me talk about that in the last slide. Okay, so phonological and orthographic pattern knowledge and use activities, things you can do for these type of errors. So the assessment indicates students omitting letters for phonemes present in words. So you want to explicitly tie the students' emerging knowledge and use of phonemes to the act of spelling. Uses the example of sound strings. You put different color beads on a string, and you use that. This is raising that level just to multisensory. You're teaching it explicitly, but by adding the strings, you're adding a visual and a kinesthetic approach, so it becomes multisensory for the students, not just the auditory component. And so you have it on the strings, and you sound out the word for each sound, and the student has to take the string and the beads and match a letter for every bead that they see. So they may have difficulties with a specific class of phonemes. If you identify certain class, such as, what's the example the book use? Uncommon for students to have particular difficulties segmenting consonant clusters. So you might just focus on clusters, S-blends, L-blends. That's not uncommon from what we do in treatment of speech sound disorders. That should be pretty easy for you to apply that strategy. And then you also have the strategy of word sorts. And this is teaching students to become mini linguists, so to speak. And it's also meta-linguistic, is thinking about language. And so you give them a series of words, and you have to sort them into the patterns. So the example the book has here is you're sorting the DGE pattern versus the GE. The student needs to look at that and read those words. Okay, hedge, badge, fridge, lodge, bridge. All the J sound at the end with the DGE pattern. All right, now let's look at huge, age, cage, siege, page. That's all the J sound at the end with GE, so no D there. So what is the commonality between the DGEs and the GEs? Well, saying that loud, reading it, you can see that hedge, badge, fridge, lodge, and bridge are all short vowels, versus huge, age, cage, siege, and page are all long vowels, hence the silent E rule. So you want to point that out, to facilitate that with the student, help them to get to that learning conclusion on their own. So therefore, when they counter a new word such as wedge, okay, wedge, edge. I know the W, I know the E. Now the J, am I going to spell it? You know it's not going to be J on the end, because that's just an illegal rule. We don't have words that end in J. So is it going to be DGE or GE? Well, if I put just GE, that's going to make wedge into weege. So if I put DGE, that should be right. That they can mentally get there by doing those word sorts. That's what you want to facilitate with them through your scaffolding and teaching instruction. All right, so multilinguistic strategies to improve morphological knowledge. You can do word sorts for morphemic knowledge, so you can have past tense, and you can have ing and s versus es. You can have words that change the spellings based on morphemes, like hop, hopping versus hoping. You can have a knowledge of base. You want to build a knowledge of base or root words that's crucial for spelling, reading, and inferring meanings to new derived words. So a word relative strategy, and this uses the analogy that you have relatives. Everybody has relatives, so words have relatives too. And I can remember seeing Ken Apple speaking in New Orleans, and he was talking about the analogy of mnemonic, and that when we see the word mnemonic, the example he gives in the book, excuse me. So when we see mnemonic, we think, my goodness, where did they come up with that? M-N-E. That does nothing in English starts with M-N. And so he then uses the example of amnesia. And mnemonic and amnesia are both words that are talking about memory, and that the root word there is in the A-M-N-E. I think it's a Latin root, maybe. I'd have to look it up. But it's in the root that they both are related to memory. So you make connections between word relatives, how words are related to each other for spelling. Opposition versus opposite versus opposing versus opponent all have that root word of oppose. So in a lot of English language arts curriculums, you'll see portions of this incorporated, but not necessarily to the extent where the student's getting the ownership of learning that strategy and being explicitly taught that. So that's what you need to do, is help aid the teachers in teaching that explicitly. that knowledge of root words, because it could help aid them so much. And that would help you, even as a grad student or somebody who's an undergrad going into graduate school. If you have morphological knowledge, that's really going to greatly aid you in taking the GRE, which has such a strong vocabulary component. And if you can know how to analyze words based on their roots, then you have a better vocabulary knowledge and hence a better score in the GRE. So obviously y'all did fine to get here to this point. But for future reference, I always say if I had known what I know now when I took the GRE, I would have blown the top out of the vocabulary because I would have known exactly how to attack it strategically. It also uses the picture this strategy, and this is when you develop a mental picture in your head, and it uses the analogy of describing the room left to right and right to left, and now we're going to picture the word. And this is something that you're just this is one of those that you're memorizing, but you're not teaching them in the traditional rote memorization of writing it 5 times. They're going to close their eyes and visualize it. They're going to spell it left to right. They're going to spell it backwards. They're going to spell it. They're going to write it in the air. So any way that they can to picture the word to develop that MGR. And then finally, multilingual instruction at the classroom level. You can introduce the language knowledge strategies via curriculum units. So you don't have to throw out the curriculum, but per unit you could teach phonological strategies in the first unit, and orthographic in the second, and the MGRs in the third, the morphological in the third. But always incorporating all of it together. You're not going to, just because you move on to the third unit of morphological, you're not going to drop the phonological component and instruction, but aligning it across the curriculum. And you can place words into the most appropriate curriculum unit. So you might, it points out you might have some initial, teachers might have some concern about not following spelling word lists suggested by the reading curriculum. So you can take the curriculum and sort the words together to make them be more related to each other. So essentially I used to go into a classroom. It was an inclusion classroom, and I would do weekly spelling lessons. And so I didn't have a lot of say in the curriculum at that point. But every second grade teacher was following the same curriculum regarding the spelling words, pretty much straight from the textbook. And so you would have silent E patterns, and you would have CVC patterns, and you'd have A digraphs, and you have diphthong. Everything was all mixed together. There was no rhyme or reason to the words other than these words appeared in the story. In addition to that, you had the vocabulary words, and you'd have morphemes mixed in there and all these things. So I would go in weekly, and I would use the color-based strategies of putting the different components of the words, the vowels one color, consonants another color. And I would talk about why this word was spelled this way, and we would sort the spelling words into their different categories. We would sort the CVCs together, and if we had two silent E patterns, we would put those in a column. If we had some common digraphs, we put those in a column, and we'd talk about the meaning of the words. We'd do visualizations, and this was whole class. And students greatly benefited from it, as well as the teacher. The teacher was amazed at the types of knowledge I had about how words could be broken down. She just had never thought of it like that. So I used that to help improve the children's overall reading ability and their overall spelling. So I just worked around the curriculum. It's better to work with the curriculum and modify it to be more, what's the word I'm looking for? At 11:30 at night. You want everything to be to come together and be consistent, and you want to have a pattern to the spelling words you're selecting. But sometimes you don't have that luxury, and you can just work around it. But you don't have to throw everything out. You can build these strategies within the curriculum, helping teachers understand these strategies and how to use this approach to teach spelling.